Welcome. Tonight we travel across the sea to the islands of Japan, where mountains, forests, and quiet villages shaped the rhythms of daily life for centuries. Long before modern cities filled the landscape, most people in Japan lived in small farming communities surrounded by rice fields, rivers, and forests. Wooden homes stood along narrow paths while temples and shrines rested quietly among the trees. Daily life followed the natural rhythms of the seasons. Farmers planted rice in the spring, tended their fields through the summer, and harvested crops in the autumn months. Families gathered in simple homes where meals were prepared over small hearths and evenings were often spent sharing stories or enjoying moments of quiet rest. Tonight we will slowly explore what daily life may have been like in ancient and feudal Japan. From peaceful mornings in the countryside to the quiet calm of night beneath the mountains, we will follow the gentle rhythms of life in one of the most fascinating cultures in history. Morning in a Japanese village. Morning in a traditional Japanese village often began quietly. Soft light from the rising sun slowly spread across the landscape. Mist sometimes lingered above nearby rivers or rice fields while birds called from the surrounding forests. Wooden homes built from timber and paper walls stood close together along narrow dirt paths. Inside these homes, families began preparing for the day. Rice was one of the most important foods in Japanese society, and preparing meals often began early in the morning. Farmers gathered tools and prepared to walk toward nearby fields. Others traveled toward village markets or workshops where daily work would begin. As the sun rose higher above the mountains, the quiet village slowly came to life. Rice farming in ancient Japan. Rice farming was one of the most important parts of daily life in ancient Japan. Most villages were built near rivers or valleys where water could be used to grow rice. Rice fields were carefully prepared by flooding sections of land to create shallow pools where young rice plants could grow. Farmers planted rice seedlings by hand, standing in the water while placing rows of plants into the mud. These flooded fields, known as paddies, required constant care. Farmers controlled water levels using small channels and irrigation systems. Because rice required cooperation to grow successfully, farming communities often worked together to maintain irrigation and prepare fields. Rice became more than just a food source. It was also used as a form of wealth and taxation during many periods of Japanese history. Japanese village homes. Traditional homes in ancient Japan were built using wood, bamboo, and thatched roofs. Because Japan experiences earthquakes and humid weather, buildings were designed to be lightweight and flexible. Many homes had wooden frames with walls made from paper screens known as shoji. These screens allowed soft light to enter the home while keeping the interior cool during warm months. Floors were often covered with woven straw mats known as tatami. People usually removed their shoes before stepping onto these mats. Inside the home, rooms could be rearranged by sliding the paper screens open or closed. This flexible design allowed families to use space for sleeping, eating, and daily activities. Tea and daily life. Tea eventually became an important part of Japanese culture. Tea plants were first introduced to Japan from China around the 9th century. Over time, tea drinking became a daily habit in many communities. People prepared tea using simple utensils and hot water. In later centuries, the practice of preparing and serving tea developed into the Japanese tea ceremony, which emphasized calmness, respect, and simplicity. Tea houses were designed to create peaceful environments where people could relax and enjoy quiet conversation. Even outside formal ceremonies, tea remained an important daily drink across Japanese society. Japanese markets. Village markets were places where people gathered to trade goods and share news. Farmers brought rice, vegetables, and fish to sell or exchange. Craftsmen offered items such as pottery, tools, baskets, and cloth. Merchants sometimes traveled between towns carrying goods from distant regions. Markets were often lively places filled with conversation and activity. People not only purchased food and supplies but also exchanged stories about events happening in nearby villages. These markets helped connect communities across rural Japan. Samurai and warrior society. During certain periods of Japanese history, a class of warriors known as samurai played an important role in society. Samurai served powerful lords called daimyo and were responsible for protecting territories and maintaining order. They followed a code of conduct known as bushido, which emphasized loyalty, honor, and discipline. Although samurai are often remembered for their skills in battle, many also studied literature, poetry, and philosophy. Their training included both physical combat and intellectual learning. Samurai culture influenced many aspects of Japanese history and tradition. Japanese crafts and artisans. Craftsmanship was highly valued in traditional Japanese society. Skilled artisans created many objects used in daily life. Potters produced bowls, cups, and cooking vessels from clay. Carpenters built homes, temples, and furniture using carefully shaped wooden beams. Weavers produced cloth from silk or plant fibers. Paper makers created strong paper used for writing and building materials. Many of these crafts required years of training and practice. These traditions helped produce objects that were both practical and beautiful. Temples and spiritual life. Religion and spiritual practices were an important part of life in ancient Japan. Two major traditions shaped spiritual life: Shinto and Buddhism. Shinto focused on reverence for natural spirits known as kami, believed to exist in mountains, rivers, trees, and other elements of nature. Shrines dedicated to these spirits were often built in peaceful natural settings. Buddhism, which arrived from China and Korea, introduced temples where monks studied teachings about compassion and enlightenment. Many communities had both shrines and temples where people prayed for protection, good harvests, and good fortune. Travel in ancient Japan. Travel between villages and towns often took place along narrow dirt roads or mountain paths. Because Japan's landscape includes many mountains and forests, travel could be slow and difficult. People sometimes walked long distances carrying goods on their backs or using simple carts. Rivers were also used as transportation routes when possible. Travelers moving between regions helped spread ideas, goods, and cultural traditions. Although travel required effort, it helped connect communities across the islands of Japan. Evening in a Japanese village. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, daily work gradually slowed. Farmers returned from the rice fields while fishermen finished their work along nearby rivers or coastlines. Families gathered inside their wooden homes where meals were prepared. Rice, vegetables, and fish were common parts of the evening meal. Paper lanterns provided gentle light inside homes as darkness settled across the village. Outside, the sounds of insects and distant water created a calm atmosphere. Night in ancient Japan. When night finally arrived, the village grew quiet. Lanterns glowed softly through the paper walls of homes. The surrounding forests and mountains rested beneath the dark sky. Without modern lighting, the stars appeared bright above the landscape. For a few peaceful hours, the village rested before the next morning's work began again. The rhythm of life in ancient Japan continued quietly from one day to the next. Rice terraces and farming techniques. Rice farming in Japan required careful planning and cooperation between villagers. Many rice fields were built as terrace paddies, especially in mountainous areas where flat farmland was limited. Farmers carved steps into hillsides and filled these terraces with water diverted from nearby streams. The water helped keep rice plants healthy while also protecting crops from certain weeds. Growing rice required many stages of work. First, the soil had to be softened and flooded. Then young rice seedlings were transplanted into the paddies by hand. Throughout the growing season, farmers carefully controlled water levels using small channels and wooden gates. When autumn arrived, families gathered together to harvest the rice using sickles. After harvesting, rice plants were dried and the grains were separated from the stalks. Because rice farming required so much cooperation, it helped create strong community ties between villagers. Working together ensured that irrigation systems functioned properly and crops were protected from flooding. Rice eventually became the most important crop in Japan and played a major role in the country's economy and culture. Fishing villages along the coast. Japan is an island nation surrounded by rich fishing waters. Because of this, Many communities developed along coastlines where fishing became a central part of daily life. Fishermen used wooden boats to travel short distances into the sea. They caught fish using nets, traps, and simple fishing lines. Common fish included mackerel, sardines, sea bream, and tuna. Fishing boats often returned to shore in the afternoon where families cleaned and prepared the catch. Some fish were eaten fresh while others were preserved through drying or salting. Dried fish could last much longer and became an important food supply during colder seasons. Fishing villages often developed close relationships with nearby farming communities. Farmers traded rice and vegetables in exchange for fish and seafood. This exchange helped both communities maintain a balanced diet and stable economy. Wooden architecture in Japanese villages. Traditional Japanese buildings were carefully designed to work with the natural environment. Wood was the most common building material because forests were abundant across the islands. Carpenters used joinery techniques that allowed wooden beams to fit together without nails. This method created structures that were strong but flexible. Flexibility was important because Japan frequently experiences earthquakes. Buildings constructed from wood could move slightly during earthquakes without collapsing. Roofs were often covered with straw, wooden shingles, or clay tiles depending on the region. Large overhanging roofs protected homes from heavy rain during the wet season. These architectural techniques allowed villages to survive in a landscape shaped by both mountains and natural disasters. Japanese gardens and nature. Nature played an important role in Japanese culture. Even small homes sometimes included carefully arranged gardens. These gardens were designed to reflect harmony between humans and the natural world. Rocks, trees, moss, and water features were arranged in ways that created peaceful landscapes. Rather than appearing wild or chaotic, gardens were carefully shaped to create balance and calm. Many temples and shrines also included gardens where visitors could walk quietly and reflect. These natural spaces encouraged moments of rest and contemplation. The Japanese appreciation for nature influenced art, poetry, architecture, and daily life for centuries. Writing and literature. Japan developed a rich literary tradition influenced by both Chinese and native writing systems. Early Japanese scholars studied Chinese characters known as kanji. Over time, Japan also developed phonetic writing systems known as hiragana and katakana. These writing systems allowed people to record stories, poetry, and historical events. One of the most famous works of early Japanese literature is the Tale of Genji, written in the 11th century. This story describes life within the imperial court and is often considered one of the world's earliest novels. Poetry was also highly valued in Japanese culture. Short poetic forms such as waka and later haiku captured simple observations about nature and daily life. A quiet evening in old Japan. As the sun begins to set behind distant mountains, the pace of life in the village slowly changes. Farmers return from the rice fields carrying tools used throughout the day. Fishermen guide their boats back toward quiet harbors. Smoke rises gently from the rooftops of wooden homes as evening meals are prepared. Inside homes, families gather on tatami mats while lantern light fills the room with a warm glow. Outside, the air grows cooler as insects begin to sing in nearby fields. The village becomes peaceful once more as darkness slowly spreads across the landscape. Rice as the foundation of Japanese society. Rice was more than just a food in traditional Japanese life. It became the foundation of the economy and even the political system during many historical periods. For centuries, rice production determined the wealth of villages and regional leaders. Land was often measured by how much rice it could produce. During feudal periods, powerful lords known as daimyo collected taxes from farmers in the form of rice rather than coins. These rice taxes were stored in large warehouses and later distributed or traded. Because rice held so much value, protecting rice fields was extremely important. Flooding, drought, or pests could threaten an entire village's food supply. As a result, communities worked together carefully to manage irrigation systems and protect crops. The importance of rice helped shape the rhythms of daily life across rural Japan for generations. Traditional Japanese meals. Meals in ancient and feudal Japan were often simple but carefully prepared. Rice was usually served as the main part of the meal. It was commonly accompanied by fish, vegetables, and small amounts of pickled foods. Pickling was a useful method for preserving vegetables for long periods. Soybeans were also widely used in cooking. They were processed into foods such as tofu, miso, and soy sauce, which became important parts of Japanese cuisine. Meals were often served in small bowls placed neatly in front of each person. Rather than large shared dishes, individuals usually ate from their own bowls. This style of dining became an important tradition in Japanese culture. Clothing in ancient Japan. Clothing in traditional Japan was made from materials such as hemp, cotton, and silk. Farmers and villagers typically wore simple garments designed for comfort and durability. One of the most recognizable garments was the kimono, a long robe wrapped around the body and tied with a sash called an obi. Although modern kimonos are often associated with formal occasions, earlier versions were everyday clothing. Different fabrics and colors could indicate a person's status or occupation. Silk clothing was especially valuable and often worn by members of noble or wealthy families. Over time, clothing styles developed into the elegant designs that became associated with traditional Japanese culture. Japanese roads and travel routes. Travel across Japan often required navigating mountainous terrain. Because the islands are filled with hills and forests, roads frequently followed valleys or coastal areas. Travelers moved between towns on foot, sometimes carrying supplies using wooden frames or baskets. Pack animals such as horses were occasionally used, especially for transporting goods. Important routes eventually connected major cities and castle towns. These roads allowed merchants, government officials, and travelers to move between regions. Although travel could be slow, these pathways helped connect communities throughout the islands. Art and calligraphy. Writing in Japan was not only practical but also considered an art form. The practice of calligraphy involved carefully writing characters using brushes and ink. Each brushstroke required concentration and precision. Scholars and artists practiced calligraphy as a way of developing discipline and artistic expression. Beautiful writing was often displayed on scrolls or paper screens inside homes and temples. Calligraphy reflected the influence of Chinese writing traditions while developing unique Japanese styles. This art form became highly respected in Japanese culture. Japanese temples and monasteries. Buddhist temples were important centers of learning and spirituality. Monks studied religious texts, practiced meditation, and taught spiritual lessons to others. Temples were often built in peaceful locations surrounded by forests or mountains. Large wooden halls housed statues of the Buddha and other sacred figures. Visitors came to temples to pray, make offerings, and seek guidance. Some temples also served as centers for education and scholarship. These quiet places helped shape the spiritual traditions of Japanese society. Seasonal changes in Japan. The seasons strongly influenced daily life across Japan. Spring brought warmer weather and the beginning of rice planting. Summer required long hours of work in the fields. Autumn was the time of harvest, when crops were gathered and stored for winter. Winter brought colder weather and shorter days. During this time, farming work slowed and people spent more time indoors repairing tools, weaving cloth, or preparing food. The changing seasons shaped the rhythm of life in villages across the country. A quiet village night. As evening falls over the countryside, daily activity begins to slow. Farmers return home from the rice fields while fishermen bring their boats back to shore. Lanterns are lit inside wooden homes, casting soft light across the rooms. Meals are shared quietly as families talk about the day's work.
Outside, the mountains and forests grow dark beneath the night sky. The village becomes calm once more. For a few peaceful hours, the world of ancient Japan rests before morning returns. Village cooperation and community work. Life in traditional Japanese villages often depended on cooperation between families. Rice farming, which was the foundation of many communities, required careful management of water and irrigation systems. Villagers worked together to maintain channels that carried water from rivers and streams into rice fields. If one farmer neglected these systems, it could affect the crops of the entire village. Because of this, farming communities developed strong traditions of cooperation. Neighbors helped each other during planting and harvesting seasons. Large tasks such as repairing irrigation channels or building fences were often completed through shared labor. This cooperative way of life strengthened relationships between families and helped villages survive difficult seasons. Forest resources and mountain life. Much of Japan's landscape is covered in forests and mountains. These natural areas provided many important resources for nearby communities. Wood from forests was used for building houses, tools, boats, and furniture. Villagers also gathered wild plants, mushrooms, and herbs from mountain forests. Animals such as deer and wild boar were sometimes hunted for food. Mountain streams supplied fresh water and fish. These natural resources helped sustain communities living in rural areas. Because nature played such a large role in survival, many people developed deep respect for the natural world. This respect later became closely connected to the beliefs found in Shinto traditions. Silk and textile production. Silk production became one of Japan's most valuable crafts. Silk was produced using fibers from the cocoons of silkworms. Farmers raised silkworms by feeding them mulberry leaves. Once the worms formed cocoons, the delicate silk threads could be unwound and woven into cloth. Producing silk required patience and careful attention. Silk fabrics were often used for clothing worn by wealthy families and members of the imperial court. Because silk was so valuable, it became an important trade product. Over time, Japanese silk gained a reputation for its beauty and quality. Writing and education. Education was highly valued in many periods of Japanese history. Scholars studied literature, poetry, and philosophy. Much early Japanese learning was influenced by Chinese culture. Students learned to read and write using Chinese characters known as kanji. Later, Japanese writing systems called hiragana and katakana were developed to represent spoken Japanese more easily. Education helped prepare officials and scholars who served within government systems. Learning and scholarship became respected pursuits within Japanese society. The role of local lords. During feudal periods, many regions of Japan were governed by powerful landowners known as daimyo. These local lords controlled territories that included villages, farmland, and towns. Farmers living in these territories paid taxes in the form of rice. In return, daimyo provided protection and maintained order within their lands. Samurai warriors often served under these lords, acting as soldiers and administrators. This system created a hierarchy where power was organized through loyalty and land ownership. The relationships between daimyo, samurai, and farmers shaped much of Japan's social structure during feudal times. Traditional Japanese boats. Like many island cultures, Japan relied heavily on boats for transportation and fishing. Small wooden boats were used for traveling along rivers and coastlines. Fishermen used these vessels to catch fish in nearby waters. Merchants also transported goods between coastal villages using boats. Because Japan's mountains made land travel difficult, waterways often became the easiest way to move between regions. Boat travel helped connect isolated communities and allowed goods to reach distant markets. The sound of evening. As the sun begins to lower behind the mountains, the pace of village life slowly changes. Farmers gather their tools and leave the rice fields. Fishermen guide their boats back toward quiet shorelines. Smoke rises gently from the rooftops of wooden homes as evening meals begin to cook. The sounds of insects and flowing water fill the air. Lantern light begins to glow softly inside houses. The village grows peaceful as night approaches. A calm night in old Japan. When darkness finally settles across the countryside, the village becomes quiet. Families rest inside their homes while the surrounding forests and mountains lie still. Without modern lights, the night sky appears bright with countless stars. The cool evening air moves gently through the fields. For a few hours, the world becomes calm and silent. Soon the first light of morning will appear again. Farmers will return to their fields, and the rhythms of daily life will begin once more. Rice harvest season. Autumn was one of the most important times of the year for farming communities in Japan. After months of careful work in the rice fields, farmers finally gathered the crops that would feed their families through the coming winter. Harvesting rice required many hands. Families and neighbors often worked together cutting rice stalks with curved blades known as sickles. The harvested plants were tied into bundles and hung on wooden racks so they could dry in the sun. Once the rice had dried, the grains were separated from the stalks. This process was slow but essential. A successful harvest meant that the village would have enough food for the year ahead. Because of this, harvest season often brought feelings of relief and celebration. Village crafts and tools. Many objects used in daily life were made locally by skilled craftsmen. Carpenters built homes, storage buildings, and bridges using carefully cut wood. Potters shaped clay into bowls, cups, and cooking vessels used by families each day. Basket makers wove containers used to carry crops, fish, and tools. These craftsmen learned their skills through years of practice. Tools were carefully maintained because replacing them could require significant effort. The work of artisans helped supply villages with the items needed for farming, cooking, and daily household life. Japanese paper and writing materials. Japan developed a strong tradition of producing handmade paper. This paper, known as washi, was made from the fibers of plants such as mulberry trees. The process involved soaking plant fibers, pounding them into pulp, and spreading the mixture across screens to dry. Washi paper became widely used for writing, artwork, and even building materials. It was used in paper screens, lanterns, and sliding doors. Because it was both strong and lightweight, it served many practical purposes. Washi paper also allowed scholars and artists to record literature, poetry, and historical records. The sound of rivers and waterways. Water played an important role in the daily life of many Japanese villages. Rivers carried fresh water needed for drinking, cooking, and farming. They also provided fish and transportation routes. The sound of flowing water often became part of everyday life in rural communities. Small wooden bridges crossed rivers connecting farms and homes. Children sometimes played along the riverbanks while adults gathered water for household tasks. These waterways helped shape the landscapes and routines of village life. Japanese gardens and quiet spaces. Many homes and temples included carefully arranged gardens. These gardens were designed to create peaceful environments where people could reflect and rest. Rocks, moss, small ponds, and carefully shaped trees formed balanced landscapes. Rather than appearing wild, these spaces were arranged to reflect harmony with nature. Even small gardens could provide a sense of calm. The careful design of these spaces reflected the Japanese appreciation for quiet beauty and simplicity. Seasonal festivals. communities across Japan celebrated seasonal festivals throughout the year. These festivals often marked important agricultural events such as planting or harvesting. Villagers gathered to share food, music, and traditional performances. Lanterns sometimes lit the streets during evening celebrations. Festivals allowed people to relax and celebrate after long periods of work. They also strengthened social bonds between families living in the same village. Evening meals and family time. As evening approached, families gathered together inside their homes. Meals often included rice, vegetables, fish, and small portions of preserved foods. Food was served in bowls placed neatly on low tables. After eating, families sometimes spent time talking quietly or completing small household tasks. Lanterns provided soft light, while the sounds of insects and distant water filled the night air outside. These quiet moments allowed families to rest after the day's work. Night across the Japanese countryside. When darkness finally settled across the countryside, the village became peaceful. The surrounding mountains stood quietly beneath the night sky. Lantern light glowed softly through paper windows. Farmers rested after long days in the fields while fishermen prepared for the next morning. Above the rooftops, the stars shone clearly across the sky. For a few calm hours, the village slept while nature continued quietly around it. Japanese castle towns. During feudal periods, many regions of Japan developed towns centered around castles. These castles were built by powerful lords known as daimyo. Castles were often placed on hills or elevated ground where they could defend surrounding territory. Around these castles, towns slowly formed. Merchants, craftsmen, and farmers settled nearby because the castle provided protection and economic opportunity. These communities became known as castle towns. Roads, markets, and workshops developed around the castle grounds. Over time, some of these towns grew into large cities that still exist today. The presence of a castle often shaped the layout and organization of the surrounding settlement. Japanese bridges and roads. Travel between villages and towns required crossing rivers and valleys. To make travel easier, communities built wooden bridges across waterways. These bridges were carefully constructed using strong beams and simple engineering techniques. Because wood was widely available, it became the most common material for bridge building. Roads connecting villages were usually narrow dirt paths. These paths followed natural terrain through forests, valleys, and along rivers. Travel could take many hours or even days depending on distance. Despite the difficulty of travel, these roads helped connect communities across the islands of Japan. Fishing along rivers and lakes. While coastal fishing was common, many inland villages depended on rivers and lakes for food. Fishermen used small boats, or stood along riverbanks with nets and fishing lines. Freshwater fish such as carp, trout, and eel were common catches. Fish provided an important source of protein for communities that relied heavily on rice and vegetables. Some fish were eaten fresh while others were dried or preserved. Fishing along rivers often became part of daily routines for families living near water. Japanese pottery and ceramics. Pottery has been produced in Japan for thousands of years. Clay from riverbanks and hillsides was shaped into bowls, cups, and storage containers. These objects were fired in kilns that hardened the clay into durable ceramics. Pottery was used for cooking, storing food, and serving meals. Over time, Japanese potters developed distinctive styles and techniques. Some ceramics were simple and practical, while others were beautifully decorated. Many pottery traditions that began centuries ago are still practiced today. The role of nature in daily life. Nature influenced nearly every aspect of life in ancient Japan. Mountains, forests, rivers, and coastlines shaped where people built villages and how they survived. Farmers depended on rainfall and seasonal weather patterns. Fishermen relied on the cycles of tides and ocean currents. The natural environment also inspired art, poetry, and spiritual beliefs. Many traditions emphasized living in harmony with nature. This respect for the natural world became an important cultural value that continued through generations. Lantern light and evening work. After sunset, the light inside homes came from oil lamps or paper lanterns. These lanterns produced a soft glow that illuminated small areas of the room. Even after the main work of the day ended, people often continued small tasks in the evening. Clothing might be repaired, tools sharpened, or food prepared for the next day. Lantern light created a calm atmosphere inside homes, while the outside world grew quiet. Quiet paths through the village. At night, the narrow paths between homes became peaceful. The sounds of conversation faded as families settled indoors. Wooden houses stood quietly beneath the dark sky. The gentle rustling of trees and distant water often became the only sounds in the village. These calm nighttime hours allowed people to rest before another day of work began. Stars above the mountains. Without modern lighting, the night sky above ancient Japan appeared incredibly bright. Thousands of stars stretched across the sky above mountains and forests. Travelers and farmers sometimes used the stars to understand the passing of seasons. The peaceful view of the night sky brought moments of quiet reflection at the end of each day. Soon the first light of morning would return, and the rhythm of life would begin again. Bamboo in daily life. Bamboo was one of the most useful natural materials in traditional Japan. It grew quickly and was strong while remaining lightweight. Villagers used bamboo to build fences, baskets, tools, and containers. It could also be split into thin strips that were woven into mats and household items. Bamboo pipes sometimes carried water between areas of farmland. Because bamboo was flexible and durable, it became a reliable material for many daily tasks. Its natural strength allowed people to build practical objects using simple tools. Even today, bamboo remains an important part of traditional Japanese craftsmanship. Japanese cooking methods. Cooking in traditional Japanese homes often took place over small hearths built into the floor. These hearths, known as irori, allowed families to cook food while also warming the room. Iron pots were placed above the fire using hooks or simple supports. Rice was usually boiled in pots, while fish and vegetables were sometimes grilled. Because ingredients were often simple, cooking focused on preserving natural flavors. Meals were carefully arranged and served in small bowls. The preparation of food was not only about nourishment, but also about creating balance and harmony in each meal. The work of carpenters. Carpenters were among the most respected craftsmen in traditional Japanese society. Building houses, temples, and bridges required precise woodworking skills. Japanese carpenters developed advanced joinery techniques that allowed wooden pieces to fit together tightly without nails. These joints created strong structures that could last for many years. Carpenters also worked on temples and shrines that required detailed craftsmanship. The ability to shape wood with accuracy was considered both a practical skill and an artistic craft. Travelers on mountain roads. Travel between regions often required walking along narrow mountain paths. These roads sometimes climbed steep hills or wound through dense forests. Travelers carried supplies on their backs or used wooden poles to balance loads. Merchants moving between towns often transported goods along these paths. Although travel could be slow, these routes connected communities across the islands. Mountain roads allowed people to share goods, news, and cultural traditions. The beauty of cherry blossoms. One of the most beloved natural events in Japan is the blooming of cherry blossom trees, known as sakura. Each spring, cherry trees briefly fill the landscape with soft pink and white flowers. Although the blossoms last only a short time, their beauty has been admired for centuries. People often gather beneath these trees to enjoy the arrival of spring. The fleeting nature of cherry blossoms became a symbol of the passing of time and the beauty of temporary moments. This appreciation for seasonal beauty remains an important part of Japanese culture. Japanese calligraphy and brush writing. Writing in Japan often involved the use of brushes and ink. This method allowed characters to flow smoothly across paper. The practice of calligraphy required careful control of each brush stroke. Students practiced writing characters repeatedly in order to develop skill and discipline. Calligraphy became both a practical skill and an artistic form. Beautiful writing was often displayed on scrolls or hanging banners inside homes and temples. The balance and elegance of brush writing reflected the value placed on patience and precision. Quiet temples in the forest. Many Buddhist temples were built in quiet locations surrounded by nature. Stone paths led visitors through forests toward temple buildings. Wooden halls housed statues of the Buddha and other sacred figures. Monks living at these temples spent time studying religious teachings and practicing meditation. The peaceful surroundings helped create environments where people could reflect and find calm. Even today, many temples remain quiet places where visitors seek moments of silence and rest. Rivers flowing through the countryside. Rivers flowing through the countryside provided many benefits for nearby communities. They supplied water needed for drinking, cooking, and farming. Riverbanks also became gathering places where villagers washed clothes or collected water. Small wooden bridges crossed these waterways, connecting fields and homes. The steady sound of moving water became a familiar part of everyday life in many villages. Lanterns at dusk. As evening approached, lanterns were lit inside homes and along village paths. These lanterns were often made using paper stretched over wooden frames. Inside, small flames provided gentle light. The glow from these lanterns created a warm atmosphere as darkness settled across the village. Lantern light reflected softly on wooden walls and tatami floors. This quiet lighting helped bring a calm end to the day. The stillness of the Japanese night. When the village finally became quiet, the surrounding landscape seemed to rest as well. Mountains stood silently in the distance. Fields and forests lay beneath the dark sky. The sounds of insects and flowing water filled the night air. Without bright lights, the stars appeared clearly above the rooftops. For a few peaceful hours, the world of ancient Japan remained calm and still before the arrival of another morning. Samurai armor and equipment. Samurai warriors were known not only for their discipline but also for their distinctive armor. Their armor was carefully designed to provide protection while still allowing flexibility in movement. Instead of heavy metal plates, samurai armor often used small iron or leather scales tied together with silk cords. This design allowed the armor to bend and move with the body. Helmets known as kabuto protected the head and often included decorative crests. Some helmets featured elaborate designs that helped warriors stand out on the battlefield. Samurai also carried weapons such as bows, spears, and swords. The most famous sword associated with samurai is the katana, known for its curved blade and sharp edge. Although samurai were trained for battle, many also studied literature, philosophy, and art. Japanese swordsmiths. Creating a samurai sword required incredible skill. Swordsmiths spent many hours carefully forging each blade. The process began by heating steel and repeatedly folding it while hammering. This folding technique helped remove impurities and strengthen the metal. The blade was then shaped, sharpened, and polished until it achieved its final form. Some swordsmiths became highly respected for their craftsmanship. Their blades were considered not only weapons but also works of art. Many swords were passed down through generations as treasured family possessions. Japanese boats and coastal travel. Because Japan is surrounded by water, boats were essential for transportation and fishing. Small wooden boats were used along rivers, lakes, and coastal areas. Fishermen used nets and lines to catch fish close to shore. Merchants sometimes used larger vessels to transport goods between coastal towns. These boats allowed communities separated by mountains to stay connected. Water travel often proved easier than crossing rugged landscapes on foot. For many villages, the sea served as both a source of food and a natural highway for travel. Poetry and reflection. Poetry held an important place in traditional Japanese culture. Short poems captured moments of beauty found in nature. One early poetic style was known as waka, which used carefully arranged lines to express thoughts about seasons, landscapes, or emotions. Later, the poetic form known as haiku became famous for its simplicity. Haiku poems often described small observations such as falling leaves, flowing water, or the arrival of spring. Through poetry, people expressed appreciation for the quiet beauty of everyday life. Quiet shrines in nature. Across Japan, small Shinto shrines were often built in natural settings. These shrines honored spiritual forces believed to exist within nature. Visitors approached shrines by walking through a gate known as a torii. Beyond the gate, peaceful paths often led through forests toward the shrine buildings. People visited these places to pray, offer respect, and seek good fortune. The quiet surroundings helped create a sense of calm and reflection. These shrines remain important cultural landmarks throughout Japan today. The first light of morning. Eventually the quiet of night begins to fade. A faint glow appears along the horizon as the first light of morning arrives. The stars slowly disappear from the sky. Birds begin calling from nearby trees while mist rises gently from fields and rivers. Inside homes, families begin preparing for another day. Farmers gather tools and walk toward rice fields. Fishermen prepare boats along the shoreline. The calm rhythm of village life begins once more. Japanese farming tools. Farmers in traditional Japanese villages relied on a variety of simple but effective tools. One of the most common tools was the hoe, used for loosening soil and maintaining rice fields. Wooden plows were sometimes pulled by animals or pushed by hand to prepare land for planting. Sickles were used during harvest season to cut rice stalks quickly and efficiently. Baskets woven from bamboo allowed farmers to carry crops and supplies between fields and homes. These tools were carefully maintained and repaired because replacing them could require a great deal of effort. Over generations, these farming tools helped communities cultivate the land and produce the food needed for survival. The work of village artisans. In addition to farming, many villages depended on skilled artisans. Blacksmiths produced iron tools such as knives, axes, and farming equipment. Potters created bowls and cooking vessels used in everyday meals. Carpenters built homes, bridges, and storage buildings. Weavers turned fibers from plants or silk into cloth used for clothing and household items. These craftsmen often passed their skills down through generations of apprentices. Their work supported the daily needs of the entire community. Without these artisans, village life would have been much more difficult. Rivers and irrigation. Water was essential for rice farming. Villagers developed small irrigation systems that carried water from rivers and streams into rice fields. These channels were carefully maintained to control the flow of water. Too much water could damage crops, while too little could cause plants to dry out. Because of this, farmers worked together to maintain the irrigation systems that supported their fields. The sound of water moving through these channels became a familiar part of daily life in farming communities. A peaceful Japanese night. As darkness settles across the countryside, the village becomes quiet once again. Lanterns glow softly inside wooden homes. The surrounding mountains and forests rest beneath the night sky. The sounds of insects and flowing water fill the cool evening air. Families rest after a long day of work. Above the rooftops, countless stars shine brightly across the sky. For a few peaceful hours, the village remains still before morning arrives again. Japanese rice storehouses. In many farming villages, harvested rice needed to be carefully stored so it would last throughout the year. Communities built raised storehouses designed specifically to protect grain from moisture and pests. These buildings were often lifted slightly above the ground on wooden pillars. Raising the floor helped keep the rice dry during rainy seasons and prevented rodents from reaching the stored grain. Inside the storehouse, bundles of rice or bags of grain were stacked neatly in rows. Because rice served as both food and currency in many periods of Japanese history, protecting these supplies was extremely important. Village leaders sometimes monitored these storehouses carefully to ensure that the harvest was preserved until the next growing season. Stone paths and village roads. Paths connecting homes, temples, and fields gradually formed the layout of many villages. Some of these routes became narrow stone paths that helped people travel safely during rainy weather. These paths wound gently between houses, gardens, and small bridges crossing irrigation streams. Travelers walking through a village might pass farmers carrying baskets, craftsmen heading toward workshops, or children helping their families with daily chores. Although simple, these paths formed the small networks that connected every part of village life. Over time, the movement of many footsteps slowly shaped these quiet roads. Japanese bells and temple sounds. Temples across Japan often contained large bronze bells. These bells were struck using a suspended wooden beam that gently swung against the metal surface. When the bell was struck, it produced a deep, resonant sound that could travel far across the surrounding countryside. The sound of these bells often marked moments of reflection or spiritual practice. In some places, bells were rung in the evening or during important ceremonies. For villagers living nearby, the slow echo of a temple bell could become a familiar and calming sound that marked the passing of time. The changing colors of autumn. Autumn brought one of the most beautiful changes to the Japanese landscape. Trees across the mountains and forests slowly turned shades of red, orange, and gold. Maple trees in particular created brilliant colors that covered hillsides and valleys. As farmers harvested rice and prepared fields for winter, the changing leaves signaled the arrival of cooler weather. These seasonal transformations were often admired in poetry and artwork. For centuries, people traveled to scenic locations simply to observe the beauty of autumn foliage. This appreciation for seasonal change became an important part of Japanese cultural tradition.
Winter in rural Japan. When winter arrived, daily life slowed across the countryside. Snow sometimes covered fields and mountain paths. Because rice farming could not continue during this season, families spent more time indoors. Inside homes, the central hearth provided warmth while meals were prepared. People used this quieter time to repair tools, weave cloth, and prepare supplies for the coming year. Winter also provided opportunities for storytelling and reflection during long evenings. Although the season could be cold, It allowed communities time to rest after months of hard work. The calm before morning. As the night gradually begins to fade, the sky above the mountains slowly brightens. The first light of dawn appears along the horizon. Birds begin calling softly from nearby trees while mist rises gently from rivers and rice fields. Inside homes, families slowly awaken as another day begins. Farmers prepare tools and walk toward their fields. Fishermen gather near rivers and coastlines. The quiet rhythm of village life begins again, just as it has for generations.
Thank you for spending this quiet time exploring the world of ancient Japan. If you enjoyed this peaceful journey through history, make sure to subscribe to Dreamtime History for more calm stories from the past designed to help you relax and fall asleep. There are many more gentle explorations ahead, from ancient civilizations to medieval villages and distant cultures around the world. For now, rest well, and thank you for watching.